Bruce Lee entered a ring full of experts. 8 seconds later, every opponent was taken down. They said the demonstration would settle an argument that had been building for years. Several respected fighters stood inside the ring, each known in his own circle as an authority. Witnesses would later agree on only one measurable detail. The exchange lasted less than 8 seconds. When it ended, every challenger was on the floor, conscious but unwilling to continue. No dramatic strikes were remembered clearly. Only a quiet sequence of movements too small, too precise to interrupt. The hall was unremarkable in appearance. Wooden floors, sunlight filtering through high windows, walls lined with mirrors and the occasional framed certificate. But the room carried a weight that no architecture could convey. It was heavy with reputation, an accumulation of years, decades even, of effort, discipline, and quiet authority. Each practitioner present moved with a precision that spoke of habitual training. Every gesture was economical, every stance rehearsed until it was instinct. Visitors would later describe the assembly as almost ceremonial. Men who had spent their lives perfecting specific styles sat in a loose circle, nodding to one another with a courteous distance. There was no laughter, no idle chatter. Even the air seemed to hesitate, as if aware that the gathering was not ordinary. The challengers, local masters, each known in his community, assessed one another as much as they assessed the visitor who had arrived. Some were older, their faces marked by years of competition and instruction. Others were in their prime, confident in reflex and reputation. Each man had a following, students who watched silently from the edges of the room, their attention unbroken. No one spoke first. Conversation began slowly, muted, with questions about form and approach, but always framed respectfully. Every word, every movement was measured. A visitor recounts later that you could feel the hesitation, the unspoken calculation, each master imagining, testing, predicting. The visitor, unassuming yet purposeful, remained calm. He did not enter to boast, nor to declare superiority. His presence was stillness itself, an observation in human form. He did not match their tension with his own. Instead, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had rehearsed absence and control far more than presence or aggression. Students would later describe the feeling in the room as, the air changed. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first. There were no gestures of intimidation, no dramatic postures. Yet every man there became aware that his assumptions were being gently but firmly questioned. Tradition met adaptability. Authority met something unfamiliar, yet undeniable. By the time the first formal challenge was proposed, a suggestion as much as a test of presence, each participant had already begun, without acknowledgement, to assess what the visitor brought into their carefully contained environment. They did not yet know how it would unfold. They only knew that this meeting, this quiet alignment of reputations, had set a stage where control would be demonstrated in ways they could not yet articulate. The hall remained silent except for soft shuffles and the occasional rustle of clothing. Observers would later recall that even in these moments before the demonstration, there was a tension that felt inevitable. Not violence, not spectacle, just inevitability. By the time doors closed behind the last latecomer, the room had shifted. What had started as polite acknowledgement of rank and skill had become a subtle acknowledgement of possibility. And in that quiet tension, the first chapter of what witnesses would later call the 8 seconds had already begun. The question itself was never loud. It did not arrive with demands or declarations. Instead, it grew from observation, from the subtle noticing of a pattern that none of the assembled masters had seen before. The visitor moved among them, demonstrating small adjustments to stance, minor refinements to movement, barely perceptible yet unmistakably effective. Some of the local masters noticed first in the gaps between steps, the brief misalignment corrected before it could matter. Others saw it in timing. A hand would meet a shoulder, not to strike, but to redirect, to unbalance, to assert control without effort. It was quiet, almost invisible, yet it left an impression that could not be ignored. This was not about arrogance or provocation. The visitor never criticized tradition or technique. He did not challenge rank directly. Yet the implication was clear. There was a different way to understand mastery, one that made conventional assumptions fragile. The question arose in hushed conversation, behind the polite smiles and nods. Could it be that what we have taught, practiced, and defended for decades might be incomplete? Observers later recounted the unease, not in words, but in the shifting of shoulders, the tightening of stances, the subtle rebalancing of attention. Authority, once absolute within the walls of lineage and style, felt unexpectedly vulnerable. It was enough to prompt a suggestion. Not a confrontation, but a demonstration, a controlled environment where the differences could be observed without injury, without risk. The visitor agreed with no flourish. The plan was simple, a brief exchange to clarify principle. Yet the clarity of principle, unknown to the challengers at the time, carried implications that would extend far beyond the room. By mid-afternoon, a quiet arrangement had been made. Observers, students, fellow instructors, and a few curious outsiders gathered around the ring. The masters who would later become the challengers adjusted their expectations. They assumed structure, rehearsal, and a measurable sequence of techniques. They assumed they could control distance, timing, and engagement. They did not know that those assumptions were already being read, tested, and subtly undone before a single movement had begun. Even now, witnesses recall the tension as calm, not dramatic. It was not excitement. It was a tension, the kind that gathers slowly, like fog over still water. Every eye fixed on the visitor, not with fear, but with the recognition that the situation had shifted. The question, simple, almost unspoken, hung in the air. How would this resolve itself? And more quietly, what would it reveal about the limits of authority? In this room of silent challenge, the stage was set. The visitor had not yet moved, yet control had already begun to assert itself, not through force, but through inevitability. By the time the small crowd had assembled around the ring, a peculiar stillness had settled. It was not the anticipation of spectacle. There was no cheer, no murmuring excitement. Instead, there was observation, careful, deliberate, and nearly silent. Students shifted from foot to foot, but their eyes remained fixed, drinking in every detail. The challengers, masters of their respective disciplines, stood slightly apart, unconsciously testing one another as much as the visitor. The tension was measured, almost invisible. It did not announce itself with shouts or posturing. Instead, it emerged from expectation and experience. Each participant carried decades of training, of victories and losses remembered in muscle memory and intuition. Each had been conditioned to anticipate, to counter, to assert authority. Yet here, those instincts were quietly disrupted. Every movement, no matter how slight, was scrutinized. Every pause carried meaning. Observers later described the moment as a study in restraint. No one stepped forward unnecessarily. No one committed prematurely. There were no striking gestures or demonstrative blows. It was as though the air itself conspired to stretch the space between action and consequence, making every decision deliberate. The visitor moved within the ring with calm, unhurried steps, never imposing, never threatening. Yet his presence carried an undercurrent of inevitability. His body language suggested understanding, an unspoken assertion that mastery was not always measured by force or volume, but by clarity, timing, and the ability to resolve tension before it erupted. The challengers, for their part, attempted to maintain composure. Their confidence rooted in known methods and familiar sequences. Yet subtle doubts began to appear. A hand hesitating, a shift of weight held longer than necessary, a glance at the visitor that betrayed curiosity and caution. Even seasoned instructors, trained to detect imbalance in seconds, found themselves studying patterns they had not expected. Students and witnesses would later describe the atmosphere as taut, like a wire stretched between 2 points. Every breath, every small adjustment was amplified in attention. And yet, despite the focus, there was no hurry. No need to fill silence with motion. In this deliberate pacing, the groundwork for the demonstration had already been laid. It was in this environment, charged not by noise, but by observation, that the first subtle signals of inevitability appeared. The challengers did not yet know it, but the rules they assumed would govern the engagement were quietly dissolving. Their authority, though long established, was already under subtle scrutiny, tested not with aggression but with precision. By the time the first movement of the demonstration began, the audience and the challengers alike were holding a shared, silent awareness. Whatever happened next would be both decisive and quietly irreversible. When the demonstration began, no one in the room realized the brevity of what was about to unfold. There was no flourish, no signal, no dramatic entry into motion. The visitor's first step was subtle, almost casual, a shift of weight that could have been mistaken for mere adjustment. Observers later admitted they had blinked, and when they looked again, the outcome was already clear. The challengers, each confident in their training, reacted instinctively. Hands rose, feet adjusted, stances recalibrated. But before any strike could fully form, control had already been applied. Not through force, but through timing, placement, and redirection. Movements overlapped, intersected, and resolved with precision so quiet that those who watched struggled to describe them. It was as though the visitor anticipated every intent, countering it without contest, without struggle. Witnesses later tried to reconstruct the sequence. Some remembered a step here, a touch there. Others described shifts in balance, angles corrected before imbalance could manifest. Every recollection agreed on the same undeniable fact. All challengers had been neutralized within 8 seconds. Yet no one could articulate exactly how it had happened. Not one punch landed as intended. Not one strike connected to cause real harm. It was control, not collision, that determined the outcome. The room remained nearly silent, even in the moments immediately after. Students whispered of incomprehensible efficiency. Senior instructors lowered their eyes, scanning the floor as if to convince themselves that the result could be explained by error. But the evidence lay in the quiet certainty of the challengers' positions. They were conscious, unharmed, yet decisively stopped. Observers later emphasized the absence of drama. There were no triumphant shouts, no theatrical gestures. The visitors' movements had been minimal, precise, almost invisible. The lesson was embedded in restraint, in the deliberate application of principle rather than brute technique. Control had been established before confrontation could take shape. In these 8 seconds, long-held assumptions about authority, skill, and preparedness were quietly dismantled. The visitor did not need to assert dominance through aggression. He did so through inevitability. Every master in the ring had understood, without discussion, that their understanding of combat had been insufficient. Yet the moment passed without spectacle, leaving only the soft echo of disrupted expectations. The silence that followed was heavy with reflection. Observers recall a stillness not of shock, but of comprehension. No one needed to speak to mark the significance. The room, once filled with subtle tension, now carried the quiet gravity of witnessed mastery. The demonstration was over before it felt like it had begun. Even years later, students would attempt to describe the moment, only to stumble over words. It was a sequence that existed in memory more as impression than instruction, a proof of principle too subtle for ordinary description, yet impossible to forget. When the 8 seconds ended, the room held its breath. Not in excitement, but in quiet acknowledgement. No one moved immediately. The challengers remained on the floor, composed but unsettled, slowly rising as if testing the reality of what had just occurred. Students and witnesses stayed rooted, eyes fixed on the subtle aftermath rather than spectacle. No one spoke at first. There was no celebration, no concession, no acknowledgement beyond the careful, measured movements of those who had been bested. The visitor remained calm, relaxed, as if the demonstration had been nothing more than a gentle adjustment of air. Yet the presence of inevitability lingered, heavy in every gaze, in every reassessment of technique and expectation. Observers later described the moment as a shift in perception. Years of structured training, meticulously preserved forms, and established hierarchies suddenly felt provisional. The challengers, men whose authority was rarely questioned, had no words to assert their status. Their mastery had been quietly, irrevocably examined and found insufficient against precision, timing, and adaptability. Students noticed small gestures, an instructor adjusting posture, a subtle nod, a deepening gaze, signs that internal reflection had begun. No one admitted vulnerability openly, yet the room itself recorded it in every subtle movement. Silence became a language, teaching more than any lecture could. The lesson was not in being defeated, but in witnessing control without aggression, influence without force, and mastery without spectacle. The quiet persisted for minutes, stretching longer than any movement or technique. When conversation resumed, it was subdued, measured, and reflective. Instructors asked fewer questions about what had been done, and more about why it had worked. The emphasis shifted from who won to what had shifted inside the room. Years later, those who had been present recalled that the weight of the lesson did not diminish with time. The silence after certainty broke, after inevitability had quietly asserted itself, was as instructive as the 8 seconds themselves. Students carried that memory forward, repeating it not in stories of victory, but in the careful practice of principle. The visitor left the hall without fanfare. Doors closed behind him, and the hall remained, heavy with reflection and recalibration. A space transformed not by spectacle, but by observation, quiet understanding, and the subtle assertion of authority through control. Years passed. The hall where the demonstration had occurred continued to host classes and practice sessions. Yet the memory of that day lingered quietly, like a shadow in the corner of the room. Always present, rarely discussed, but impossible to ignore. The story of the 8 seconds became legend not for the swiftness of victory, but for the clarity it left behind. Those who had witnessed it carried a subtle shift in perspective. Teachers adjusted their approach to instruction, emphasizing principles over rote repetition. Students began to notice the space between movements, the timing and stillness, the control that arrived without force. These lessons were not taught with words. They were observed, internalized, and repeated with restraint. The challengers themselves did not speak often of the incident, but their teaching reflected it. Movements became more economical, reactions more deliberate. What had once been unquestioned authority now included a humility rooted in experience, a recognition that skill could be dismantled in ways that were invisible until lived. Even years later, no one attempted to replicate the demonstration in full. They understood that the lesson lay not in reenactment, but in comprehension of subtle principle. Stories of the event spread slowly, told by students to students, whispered in halls and training rooms far from the original hall. Each retelling preserved the quiet authority of the visitor, the inevitability of control, and the almost imperceptible mechanics that had unmade assumptions. No one glorified the moment. No one dramatized it. It remained a benchmark of mastery, a reference point for those seeking understanding rather than spectacle. The legacy was visible in small ways. A slight pause before engaging, a shift in weight to test balance, an interruption delivered without force but with unmistakable effect. Practitioners came to understand that the demonstration had been less about defeating others than about revealing the limits of conventional perception. Control, they learned, was quiet. Authority was subtle. True mastery endured in observation and adaptation rather than in proclamation or conquest. Decades later, students of the students still referred to that day. They did not celebrate it in public halls or in competition. They remembered it in practice rooms, in the careful attention to principle, in the silent alignment of body and mind. The legend persisted, not as victory, but as evidence of possibility, a quiet testament to the power of inevitability and the enduring weight of subtle mastery. And so, the hall remained unchanged in appearance, yet transformed in spirit. The 8 seconds, brief and nearly imperceptible, left a long shadow, a teaching that stretched across generations, carried silently by those who understood that control could exist without collision, influence without aggression, and mastery without spectacle. In that quiet, the story endured, shaping minds, movements, and perceptions long after the visitor had departed.